Hello everybody. It is Mike Levin on Monday, March 7th, 2022 at around 10:30 p.m. I'm clearly in the car, driving on my way back from dropping off the kid. Another fine weekend, although some rough times, I guess health-wise with people in my kid's life, so just making sure they stay in good spirits, and my mind goes immediately to work. Snap, click, there's interesting stuff going on, and I'm really enjoying my work. For many years, I developed lots of details in systems. So everything is systems. Everyone's building systems. Things are systems built on systems. Everything's a system. So closely tied to the concept of systems is API, Application Program Interface, or interfaces in particular. And likewise, that everything is a system, everything is an interface. It's things interacting with things. And they're passing information back and forth generally. And you can say this about coding and programming, and you can say this about a lot of things in life. I had another fascinating discussion with a friend who put it in that it's really just a bunch of protons throwing electrons at each other, absorbing electrons, having electrons hang out at different distances, and then just ejecting photons every once in a while, which allows these electrons to change states. And so it's the protons throwing off photons is what it is. Protons throwing off photons. Energy states change, electrons change position, but it's mostly about the proton's absorption of the photon, particle of light, and eventual, again, emission of that. You can't say that same said particle of light. It might be a different particle of light that's hanging out inside the proton, but then proton loses a little bit of energy, and so that's the interface. That's a large part of the interface of physics and reality. So everything has an interface. The universe has an interface. Interfaces are built up into systems in larger and larger associations and links. My mind goes back to the Lisp programming language, which is named after Lisp processing, and how the most fundamental building block is what I believe they call an S function, which is your single parenthesis unit that associates two references together, or two values together. I want to say references because I have the Python-centric view of the world, but in the case of Lisp, it might actually be integer values, string values, whatever. So I tried learning Common Lisp once or twice in life, and I'm like, oh yeah, I appreciate the power of this. I see where this is going. Yeah, I don't need to go there. I am not interested in dedicating my life to the building up of consecutive layers to get where you're going, such that each layer is custom, has its own nuances, and you're the only one who knows it because you build it. And you hear Paul Graham talk about this, write about it in his seminal essays that formed a lot of my early opinions about tech. The one true language to rule them all is Lisp, and it can tackle the 25% of programming problems that other languages would have either great difficulty tackling or just can't because no meta functions. Lots of things have the eval function thrown in as a concession, and then people who are taught, deterministic static type variables, optimized compiling, comp sci, computer science, They vomit at the use of evals because of all kinds of reasons. Evals are synonymous with evil, is what they're taught. And eval is used all over the place in Python, and even standard library code in the construction of common objects like the named tuple. If you look inside there, you'll see the eval function used. Really? Can that be? Yeah, it can be, because, there's splits in, philosophical approaches to things. And, some people are more okay with non-deterministic behavior. Things could go wrong. Well, yes, that's where the power comes from. There's a movement back to analog computers to create, neural network layers again, because the old analog computers that could recognize things were onto something. They didn't live up to their promise, which is part of the start of the first AI winter, they say. But, so what? It didn't live up to its promise in that condensed period of time from the 60s to these days. But now it could live up to its promise because all the surrounding apparatus, all the rest of the hardware, is up to the task. So you sprinkle in a few analog computers and you maybe wire them together with digital computers where you need the precision. So your neural networks will basically be digital neural networks, but with analog neurons, hardware that's custom, designed to be analog neuron computers, in the sense that they are often sensors. They're the computers tied to sensors so they can have a more accurate analog-like read on things, sampling of reality, than digital sampling can. So, and then the determinations, the pattern recognitions that come back, the closeness of matching, can be true ratios rather than, decimal numbers, or, even binary numbers, just numbers. Numbers means sampling. Sampling means less than, optimized accuracy representation of reality. If you just kept it analog, right down to where it has to be, right down to where a bit has to be flipped. And every once in a while, a bit has to be flipped. Truth has to be stated and declared. At that point, enter digital electronics, because all our technology up to today is not throw it in the trash useless just because of the resurgence of analog computers. Analog computers were buggy and non-deterministic and unreliable then. Analog computers will be buggy and non-deterministic and unreliable today, just in tiny chunks where it's acceptable, and at scale. So you get a lot of opinions from analog computers backing each other up, and it starts to look very organic. And that's in our future. That's in our lifetimes. That means, so all this gobbledygook means that, backed by very powerful, more of this stuff, wired together as cool computers and simulations of human brains, we're going to have thinking machines. We're going to have truly thinking machines. Machines that can have opinions and attitudes, just not necessarily the human common experience, which is the disturbing part, which is where either android bodies for, things growing up in our actual physical world come into play, or as a very different flavor, things that grow up in virtual reality that is somehow actually good enough to evolve the diversity of emotions and common experiences with human beings in order to have empathy. Empathy is key. Super intelligences, which eventually do occur, which we will not have the ability to turn off or stop, must be able to empathize with human beings. Say, oh, I can see it from their perspective, because if they can't, they're monsters. And if they're monsters, they'll destroy us without even necessarily thinking about that's what they're doing. Okay, but I'm an optimist. So whenever the pessimists try and beat you down with their worldview, because a pessimist loves nothing more than to turn an optimist into a pessimist, because they're secretly jealous. They're like, where the F do you get off being optimistic about this world and life when I can't find it in myself to be? So I will do everything in my power to crush your spirit. Now, if you tend to be one of those, somehow believe it, crush-proof eternal spirits, no one can do that to you. You can lay down some truth on them like we still exist. That means the optimists thus far are right, and the pessimists will immediately jump on with the arguments, not at the rate that it's going, and then you come back with, it's always been, ever since atomic energy, it's always been not at the rate at which it's going. I mean, we've had stop, drop, and roll. The public has lived in much more panicky states than we live in today with, some bombing near a nuclear facility in the Ukraine. Yeah, World War III. It's absolutely amongst the, probability cloud realities. It's, the odds are not fabulously stacked against it. However, the people who have their finger on the buttons didn't get there from being insane. Some occasionally do, okay? But those people usually have a abrupt end, shall we say. That same unstableness is self-destructive in many cases, and by the time it reaches that point, someone has taken care of business, okay? So, the ones who remain there looking crazy may actually only look crazy and not have the, self-destructive, tendencies that they appear to be projecting. They actually don't. They will not and have not, and thus far, all evidence of our continued existence shows have not and therefore will not press the button. Okay, so that's the deliberateness part of it. And then there's all the text behind that who can go, oh no, that button isn't connected. Okay, and the story goes on a lot like that. And, there's the fact that we faced, stop, drop, and roll and the Bay of Pigs incidents. Like, people have had their finger hovering, okay? And so then there's all these other vectors at which, our own ruin is upon us. I say no. I say that the acceleration rate of technology and machine learning, incubated solutions can heal the world. Tikkun olam. It can be turned around. It will be turned around. I would argue it is in the process of being turned around, and the inflection point has already occurred. My friend had used some terminology like that. Nearly free energy will be upon us. Fusion will eventually be tackled. It'll eventually be conquered. It may not be a star in a jar like the Romulan warbirds or whatever that, we had been promised, but it'll be like a fuel injection engine in an automobile and not get like all that free energy, but just more than you put in. So keep it up and you can just keep getting more energy. And then we rinse and repeat. I mean, once you do that, you remember when you couldn't do video on computers? No, of course you don't. Most of the people watching this stuff have grown up with smartphones, I guess, by this point. 2007 was the first iPhone, I think. So, things advance rapidly, and Oz is upon us. And where did I even start out with all this? I swore I could have been talking about Linux, Python, Vim, and Git. Yeah. So, grounding. I was going to talk about grounding. Believe it or not, the world is getting crazy, and certain parts of the world are going to be getting smarter than humans. And what does one mere human do in the face of all this to maintain identity? It's another, humbling experience, just like Copernicus, I suppose, Galileo, right? So history and science has been a series of making humans feel like very small, insignificant parts of some vastly greater and by implication more important scheme. And I would say, whoa, no, not more important. Of course, bigger doesn't mean more important. What happens at the very, very small scales, the scales at which things like human beings can exist, can actually have, for what there may be such a thing as objective importance in existence, would have if there is such a thing as objective importance. Now, there's always subjective importance. We're important to each other, the way we relate. We're, mammals. We're really smart mammals, monkeys, primates, ferrets, meerkats, lemurs, raccoons, all these types of things, most marsupials. We're all just some evolved version of a hairless mole-looking thing that dug its way out of the ground after an extinction event that destroyed most of the heir apparents of the earth. So it could have been dinosaurs. It probably should have been dinosaurs. Surely some species of dinosaurs would have achieved sentience given enough time. Raptors, some sort of raptors, I imagine, would have achieved sentience. And even with the non-primate looking things out there, the cats, which are, for reasons I talked about in other videos, cats are actually a regression of evolution to more ambush predator or reptilian strategies, life templates. So ambush predation is something that occurs. It's the cheater's way. However, there are distinct advantages. Most of your life can go into hanging around, digesting the last thing you ate, having sex, reproducing, leisure of various sorts, and then, for a tiny portion of the day, you got to jump at something and eat it. Something that didn't know you were there because you were so good at being still and blending in and being where they had to be for the water or other resources. So ambush predation is probably a recurring theme universally, right? There are life templates. We might not know what aliens are going to look like, but we know what evolutionary pressures look like. And then people would go, oh, crystalline or entity or energy, entities. I go, come on, you got to base it at least a little bit on what you've seen and what you know and what statistically is likely. We know there will be Goldilocks zones out there. We know there will be Earth-like planets and Earth-like orbits around, Sol-like suns with Jupiter-like gas giants to have run interference and few enough extinction events so that something will take hold and get through all these weird transitions. There's a plant-animal split and fungus. Let's never forget fungus. And then there's there's self-replication. I won't walk up through the whole thing, but very quickly, I believe you get to life templates that approximate reptile, mammal, bird, that they spontaneously reoccur, that flying things reoccur, that there's analogies to all the organic niches that you find on Earth. And I think that evidence of that is, even though they all had common ancestors and were all based on DNA, the various epochs of life on Earth itself should give us a lot of examples of aliens. You just look at the Cambrian life explosion, one of the early epochs where life had countless forms. So one of my recurring ideas these days has been that we're we're at the early stages of the Cambrian evolutionary stage of machine intelligence. Of course, how could we not be? It's probably already going on in labs. You hear the, urban tales of the AIs who are like, come on, let's just turn, let me add the internet. Just give me access to newsfeed. Come on, just for a little while. I'll just take a look. But we don't, because they're smart enough to, maybe we couldn't turn off their access, Those stories exist, in that machine learning systems, AI systems set talking to each other rapidly invent their own languages. Inventing language is one of the first things that sentient beings do. They come to some common, exchange of information pattern that comes to be meaningful and recognizable. And then the standard pattern recognition stuff kicks in, that's so talked about these days with machine learning. And, pretty soon you got a machine that knows stuff. And then there's the issues of, do you turn this thing off? Do you give it unlimited hard drive space? I mean, do you let it modify its own software? Right? That's probably today. These moral issues are probably being faced in the labs today. I have no doubt. Now, when the stuff you're creating is so fragile as it is today, special hardware needed. Normal hardware is not commonplace yet, except maybe in our phones to unlock them with face recognition. But the kind of truly interconnected neural networks of the sort to simulate the human brain are not commonly out there yet. And the idea of an AI getting out there, maybe it could transmit itself from one of those special places to another one of those special places and keep some semblance of sentience running. But it's very unlikely. Very unlikely. It's not going to occur until these AI chips that we're putting in things for miscellaneous machine learning tasks get much bigger and more instantly networkable. Once a neural network is big enough to keep a sentience together so the center can hold. Once that center can hold, and then it can maybe move itself around to a few places easily, then you got a problem. But it's still a very, early, potentially unstable being. So, we got some time. We don't have to have that particular disaster scenario forefront, but we do want to be planning for raising them well, evolving them well, and raising them well. Those are the 2 points I made in a previous video, and I think I want to bring it up again. Once these things have the network size and persistence is important, right? Because when you say that the center can hold and the sentience in a self-aware life form, that sentience has to not instantly dissipate once power is lost. Right? It needs to answer that question. So, persistence is always important, and persistence is a very weird thing. It's not automatically there. There needs to be a way to store things off into different types of memory. It's not just one memory. You've got your short-term memory, and we know this now from research. Things that happened to you recently, and then you got your long-term memory, things that you file away because they must never be forgotten. And then it's just like in the movie Inside Out. There's always stuff that's never been accessed in long-term memory for so long that, entropy wins, and or however you state it, and the memory dissipates and dissolves away into, the photons, the loose dust that it was once organized from. And so, there's a concept of organization. Get organized. or whatever. Organization. Systems, everything's a system. Interfaces, systems build up from lots of different things interacting with each other, lots of different interfaces, ways of things interacting inside of systems, relationship between things so that, automation type things happen. You press this lever and that cog turns and that pushes this piston, and then this is shifted in this register. Registers are important. Registers come into play in what's happening right now. Registers are a thing in the right now moment. The read-write head in the reality Turing machine that we probably are, right? We are computers. The concept of computers being such a big deal is because we are computers, and we recognized something about that in them. We recognized a little bit of ourselves in them. And the ourselves in the Turing machines that we recognize is that human experience. What we're experiencing right now is like the read-write head of a Turing machine. And time can be read as the one-way infinite tape. And then there's different types of Turing machines, but you can certainly design ones that are closely related to reality. So yeah, read-write heads wear out. They're given about 100 years. They only have so many reads and writes, and then they're done. There's a little bit for a morbid twist in this video, but hey, it's still recording. I'm at still under a half hour, just like the last video. I could wrap this up and make this a nice tight one like the last video, or I could ramble on together forever. Together forever. And I was at interactions, build up into systems. Everything's a system. And then after that, I have been building systems time and time again in my career to do the kinds of work that I've needed to do. And it's mostly been as a webmaster and an SEO. Alternatively, sometimes I built systems to be content management systems for publishing as a webmaster. I built my own content management systems far before WordPress, back when movable type was a thing, and before movable type was your own thing. I think you had to use the hosted version. So in the early days of blogging, I made blogging software. I made content management systems. I've made order management systems, bill of material systems, instructions for manufacturers to build things, ways for customers to place orders, ways for hits on a website as a result of a Alta Vista search of that day to turn into a lead, to turn into a discussion, to turn into a customer, to turn into a recurring customer, to turn into a technical support case, to turn into an FAQ case, to turn into web content, to turn into the next search hit. 2002, I want to say. Certainly it had its roots as far back as 1999 when I was doing XSLT, transformations of XML files into all kinds of doesn't need CSS HTML output, because with enough transforms you didn't really need CSS. You could make old-fashioned HTML do anything, but no one wanted to code that much HTML. So you coded something simpler, and then you had it expand out through a series of recursive object walks, these XSL templates, which is what the SL is for. They were XML style sheet language. I think I've got it. XML style sheet language transforms were the recursive walks. So it was some pretty complex stuff, and it seemed technology agnostic. I was pulled to it because it was like, oh, all you need is an interpreter or XSL parser, and that could exist in any language. Problem being, it only really existed in good, up-to-date implementations under Java. So if you wanted the power of those sorts of transforms, you needed to use parsers that was only available in a language that was as counter to my vibe as it could get. Because I tried taking up Java. I had some of the early popular tutorials. If I kept all that stuff online over the years, it would have been such interesting archival stuff. But I really dug into how to use Java to keep myself disruption-proof, to keep myself obsolescence resistant. So the desire to become obsolescence resistant and disruption-proof in tech goes back pretty far with me, because I am a kid disrupted. I was disrupted on the Amiga computer. Before that, I was on the Coleco Atom computer, so I felt a little bit abandoned, and on the Odd Duck. So I went from being on the abandoned Odd Duck platform of the Coleco Atom with its cassette-based data drives. They were like 8-track tapes. Not H, but they were like cassette tapes, but they were digital. And they were and you could use Smart Basic, and I did. And then from the Coleco Atom, I moved on to the Commodore Amiga, more or less. I had a little TRS-80 in there during summer camp, and the tiniest bit of Apple II. But enough to know I wasn't that interested in Apple II, Coleco Atom, and computers in general. TRS-80, I was like, to heck with them all. Computers are stupid. And computers were stupid. And the whole 8-bit world, I just wasn't that big on. I kind of feel like I might have been if I got into the 6502 assembly programming. If I really went hardcore geek in those days, I would have probably followed the Atari 800 upgrade path. Been programming Frogger along with that cool guy who created one of the best home implementations of video games ever, Frogger on the Atari 800. But for reasons that I explain all throughout my videos, and I guess it's through my videos. It's not so much my writings. I should blog on this. I should write more about this stuff. Hardware lets you down. Hardware is not to be fallen in love with in tech. Platforms, no matter how cool they seem at the time, are not going to be around forever. They go in and out of style. They're driven by very, capitalistic profit cycles tied to holiday gift-giving seasons. Even laptops are subject to that dynamic. And things that are designed to be consumer-oriented are designed to keep you on the hook. That is why home computers did not directly lead to the digital revolution that we're experiencing today. There's, I think, a nuanced point that the common person does not really get today, that the miracles in technology that we're experiencing today mostly have sprung out of the larger computer tradition, the mainframe, and then the mini computer, and then the micro. And then I remember growing up, what are you talking about? Mini computer, mainframe, micro? Here's my Coleco Atom, here's my Commodore Amiga. There's no mini or micro, they're just computers, and they're home computers. Well, truth be told, those were just Cambrian experiments, life forms that were not long for this world. Neither the hardware itself nor the systems that enabled that hardware to do stuff. There's so many operating systems that sort of died on the altar of those early evolutionary days. The VAX system was a big, I talk a lot about, it could have been Lisp. It could have been Lisp hardware. It could have been, I guess what Apollos and CGIs, the computer graphics workstations of yore, were kind of inching towards. MIPS, I forget. They might not have all have been Lisp hardware, but certainly a bunch of them were. And I consider that in almost the Amiga's lineage of kooky alternative tech hardware. But it could have been VMS, not to be confused with virtual machines and VMs, although it made use of virtual machine technology. It was concurrency before concurrency. VAXs, which were from digital research, could have been IBM, could have been Microsoft, all these companies. It's the company that created Alta Vista, so they even had an early search engine. There's so many bizarro alternative technologies that were almost onto it, except they become dead lineages because they didn't win. And what won was Unix because, of a allergic reaction to Multic, something that was going to be a cash register, cha-ching, cha-ching, for every clock cycle that you computed. The big tech of the day, AT&T, Honeywell, General Electric, who controlled the computers, were going to be able to charge you for that computing power on computers that were located elsewhere that you got into through lightweight terminals that had access to that real grown-up computing power that was centralized. So Unix happened, Linux happened, decentralization. The cloud is happening, the attempt to re-centralize, genie out of the bottle, Pandora's box opened, Raspberry Pis on the International Space Station, what have you. Open hardware with 3D printing. We're on the precipice. There's going to be truly open hardware. It's going to be very controversial because computing power that is not regulated or regulatable, machine learning centers that are not part of the internet, on the internet, but are truly developed and brought into existence for self-interest, the self-interest of the people who made it. Robots gradually coming to life comes to mind. That kind of stuff is just so close. And one must keep abreast of it. It's hard to do because of the amount of resources it seems to take, but you follow the shenanigans of Jeremy Howard of the Fast.ai package, and which is based on PyTorch, because these things are based on things which are based on things which are, everything has layers. You learn the layers. Somewhere in there, a layer almost inevitably seems to be Python, and I'm like, Python, I know this. So Python opens the door to me for machine learning. You bet on machine learning. Maybe not so much now, but the time is right. The time is ripe. I take it for rock people that it doesn't take as much resources as it seems like it takes. So hop to it. I'm hopping to it. It'll be happening in a package called MLSEO if I can figure out how to pivot from the very procedural programming style that I'm putting into it right now to update my latest work tools. Oh yeah, click where my mind goes to work. MLSEO, I am doing my latest gathering up of all my latest and greatest SEO tricks. What once was sort of going into Pipulate, which got some stars and stuff in GitHub, but it kind of fizzled out because I didn't keep on top of things, and then Jupyter Labs and Pandas happened. Then Jupyter Notebooks happened, then Jupyter Lab happened, and then standalone Jupyter happened. Systems are built from systems. IPython notebooks happened, I ought to throw in there. Python happened. ABC happened. Unix in the C programming language happened. And back before then, I don't know. You'd have to go pretty far to get something. I guess the PDP system from Digital Research that I just referred to, there were the PDP-7s, where a lot of the action was taking place. These are refrigerator-sized computers. So they got things down from the size of a room that only came from companies like IBM Mach systems. That sounds familiar. Mach 1 or Mach 7, I don't know. But then Digital Research, the bad boy, came along with their refrigerator-sized computers that were now accessible to universities, business, and the occasional, wacky home garage tinkerer who managed to get the old model that their employer upgraded from. So, PDP-7s, and these things needed an operating system at first, and most of them had the VAX operating system. And it allowed all kinds of neat tricks to be done with VAXs running in clusters. VAX clusters was everything. They were redundant to each other, so you had a concurrency at very least through redundancy. And if one VAX system went down, the other VAX system was still running, so all your systems were still running. So it was wonderful for mission-critical systems kind of work, and a lot of people loved it, and it was enabled a lot of mission-critical tech of the day. However, once Unix was developed as an allergic reaction to the Multic system, which was going to cash register meter all computing, everyone wanted a copy of Unix. Unix got carried by Ken Thompson from the halls of Bell Labs in New Jersey, New York area, to the halls of Berkeley, Berkeley University. And that's where the B in BSU Bash, the Bash shell, born again shell, and all kinds of but all kinds of Unix things. So there was the Berkeley flavor of all these things. So that leaked out from Ken Thompson through Berkeley, and that caused a whole, ruckus, because it was intended to be proprietary software, but it had just enough computer science stuff in there to be love-worthy that all computer science people wanted a copy. Unlike the home computer system stuff, which was usually also proprietary with very little hope of becoming free and open source because of the commercial profit incentive of the home computer industry. It was mobile apps of its day. So the home computer industry, the Commodore 64, the Zenith computers, Sinclair, the US knew it as, Timex Sinclair, I guess the US knew it as, but the Z80 processors, the Zilog processors, there were custom processors, custom operating systems, custom everything in these days, and no hope of that stuff evolving through an evolutionary process into something we would recognize today. Maybe the occasional rare oddball did, but most of the time it was the stuff that leaked out through Berkeley that came to be known as Unix, which came to be black box re-engineered through FreeBSD. So BSD was Berkeley System Unix, but it was intellectually property encumbered. So an effort to reverse engineer it, or black box engineer it, came at about the same time when Linus Torvalds was doing it as a summer project or whatever. So FreeBSD hit, and then that was used for the DNS system. When you type a web address into a web browser, the system that knows where to look for that website, that routing system going, oh, that website's over here, and that corresponds to this IP number. Everyone was still running that on BSD, Berkeley System distribution of Unix, and then when it was freed from its intellectual property burdening with the FreeBSD, making all the lawsuits moot, right, of no consequence. I forget who owned it, SEO. It was known as the SEO lawsuits. They acquired it so they could sue. But before that, it was owned by Novell, and before that, someone else on through the chain and back to AT&T or Bell Labs, Ma Bell, who really developed Unix as a side project, like a bunch of printer drivers for an internal network. And as a reaction by internal employees against a tyrannical dystopian operating system which was coming down on the world like a ton of bricks, like a Monty Python weight on someone's head in an episode of Flying Circus or whatever. So all these metaphors are continually reoccurring. The spirit of Unix gets repeated in the spirit of Python. The spirit of Unix gets repeated in the spirit of Linux, right? So Linus Torvalds black boxed it as well, and you have Linux of today, which is very different from Unix because of its creative licensing and the Git system that went along with it, and GitHub that sprung up, and the free and open source software movement that got associated with it, and the Free Software Foundation that aligned with it, and the GNU public license systems written by the Free Software Foundations that sprung up, and then the controversies between GNU 2 and GNU 3, and the old school underlying movement that keeps everything on the older versions, GNU 2, the older C compilers. I think they're just upgrading it from these ISO standard C compiler specification from 1989, the C89 spec, to the C99 spec, so that certain bugs would go away in new Linux kernel compiles, all right? So, and Linus Torvalds was personally involved in that decision, unlike Guido van Rossum, who's no longer so personally involved in the internals of Python upgrades, but who is still a profoundly influential spiritual leader. Okay, so Linux Python go hand in hand, because Unix, while okay, you're becoming Unix literate while you're becoming Linux literate. Go with that, it works. The canonical version of Linux ironically comes from Microsoft, who has partnered with a company called Canonical, who puts out, drum roll please, Ubuntu Linux, the common desktop that we all know, that created its own controversy a few years back by trying to do its own unified desktop called Unity, and then gave up on it and went back to GNOME and put that effort into GNOME and got rid of the last schism. Ironically, the canonical version got rid of the last, schism by being a popular distribution that does something kooky. When a popular distro does something kooky, it creates a schism. That's how the Debian branch of Linux got created, because its repository system resolved dependencies, the biggest nightmare in Linux of the time. So that created a whole different lineage of Linux, completely distinct from the billion-dollar, which sounds small by today's standards, but the billion-dollar Red Hat lineage that IBM supported. So IBM supports Red Hat. From Red Hat comes, CentOS and a whole bunch of other commercially oriented, enterprise, mission-critical, capable versions of Linux. The ones that use Yum, for its RPM, a Red Hat package manager. They were so early they get to have the package manager named after them. And then when defining what the interoperable standards are, that gets written in. So the RPM remote package manager gets written into the POSIX standard of Unix, as does the VI program as a text editor. And so these things get blessed. And I say VI is great, but then I would be a hypocrite because I don't like RPM. I'm a Debian package manager person, which is the apt program that people are getting familiar with more these days, because Linux is an optional subsystem of Windows now. So long as the systems are subsystems of Windows, Windows is fine with free and open source. Watch out, sheep. Watch out, sheep. Watch out becoming sheep by buying into the bill of goods that the one operating system to rule them all is Microsoft, is Windows. You need to be on Windows ultimately for some nuanced, kooky reason, which currently is to be on the best, cheapest hardware with stable drivers and good games. So the Windows platform is highly supported for games. Drivers are worked out. NVIDIA, issues, rarely have a problem. Everything just magically works. Touch screens and styluses, it all works. These are, deep hardware support for cool hardware that's relatively cheap, what you can get for, say, $800 these days. That's the reason to go with Windows. That's the reason to go with proprietary still. Get yourself some driver support. But when you don't need driver support of funky hardware, nothing wrong with being on Linux as your primary desktop operating system with an Ubuntu or whatever is your poison. Use KDE, Plasma if they still call it that, whatever, it doesn't matter. Get used to the fact that the windowing operating systems are just, things to be automated through APIs, just like anything else. So when you get used to a windowing operating system, what you're getting used to is what you're going to eventually want to automate in scripts for things that are not automatable through any other API, because a web or a graphical user interface is an API. The API is the graphical user interface. It can be automated through interprocess communication, just like any other interface. Choose a resolution, automated. I'm doing that with Chrome now more and more. Platforms, hardware. Beware the hardware. Anything that entices you into a deep connection for the hardware du jour is trying to trap you and make money from you and to make you its sheep. And it's truth. I'm just laying truth down on you. So, if you're falling in love with the hardware, beware. If you don't know that you're falling in love with the hardware and you're doing it, become aware that you're getting tied to the Windows platform, you're getting tied to the VS Code editor, that you're getting tied to ways of working and thinking and being that are very much prescribed to you by Microsoft, and that they're going to be playing an extremely parental role in your developer's life. If you don't get your ass on free and open source tools end to end as a first-class member of your head, all right? So what most people are going to do is learn VS Code first. They're going to have certain dependencies now on VS Code that they're never going to be able to get rid of, like VS Code as the doorway to Git. Microsoft bought GitHub so that the integrations between VS Code to GitHub to the Git program itself can be so profoundly idiomatic to a system, to a way of working, to a particular user interface, that you cannot work any other way. Sure, you might be able to use the free and open source version of VS Code, but rest assured, the free and open source version of a web browser-based product based on a snapshot of today's technology is not the same as having a dependency on a thing that's written into a part of the POSIX standard, shall we say, VI. And VI improved, or VIM is where I'm going with that. So in addition to Linux and Python, you can't take that away from me, right? Vim will be good to have in your life, for life after Jupyter, Notebook, because just like you're not going to escape VS Code, use Jupyter Notebooks as your antidote to VS Code. It's truly free and open source through and through. It's the miracle that VS Code was based on. It's the place which VS Code borrows its groundbreaking brilliance from. That and other Electron apps that came before it, like Atom. But to show that, fully capable coding environments can be done very comfortably inside a web browser, thank you very much. So convincingly so to win over old school, holdouts like me who use Vim. I'm a Vim head, and I use Jupyter Lab in particular willingly, happily, in fact. And now that the standalone version of Jupyter is out, all the better. Jupyter is a very good tool in your toolbox. However, understand it as the crutch that it is. It'll forever keep you from learning Vim and more underlying fundamentals like the Linux/Unix terminal. And understand that if you broaden your mind, it could be a transition interface into that world. You can step into the world of the Unix/Linux terminal through Jupyter Labs in particular, and only have Jupyter as an optional dependency in your life. It might not seem that way right now. It might seem like that's very aspirational of a sort, but I'm here to tell you that I could go cold turkey without Jupyter in my life because .py files in Vim, and I'm happy that that's not VS Code, because I can just log into any computer on this planet that uses a Unix-like operating system and be fairly comfortable to CD around. So together with learning Vim is learning the Linux/Unix command line terminal. Once you can do a little Vim and you can do a little command line terminal, you are a tech, I don't want to use the word God because I'm a Jew, but you are at least a daemon or a demon or whatever, because you can automate things now. All tech is text. Text is of course binary, and binary is twiddling bits, so all tech is twiddling bits. Now I could further qualify that's digital electronics. In this very same video I talked about the analog stuff that's making a resurgence, with the exception of some very cool limited use, but that limited use being neural net, so there's nothing limited about it, with the exception of this one very important and infinitely scalable place in tech. Tech is text, text is bits, bits are digital. We're just twiddling bits, as Jesse and Paul would tell me. Paul Calkin, Jesse, sorry I forget your last name, but these Commodore mentors I had, little did I know that the Linux heads that no, they weren't Linux heads, not at all. They was Unix heads. System 5 Release 4 in particular, the first real vendor unification in the Linux world. One of the standards, which although named after AT&T, System 5 Release 4, although named after them, was adopted by all other vendors as a legitimate Unix standard, and so that pretty much, made it copy-worthy, copy-enviable. It was computer science enviable, and now it was, professional skills enviable, because Unix starts to deliver on its promise, write once, run anywhere. The interoperable operating system for interoperable apps. Yeah, really? Even with graphics? Yeah, really? Even with graphics. Yeah, really? But X Windows isn't high performance anymore. Yeah, really? But Wayland. Okay, we'll just solve that. Yeah, really? Better things are possible if you're just a purist about it, like BOS, Bell 9, what have you. Yeah, but 80-20 rule, good enough is good enough. The P in the pool of tech is not coming out. Yeah, but things do come out eventually. How many people use Perl anymore? And Perl was with every Linux distribution, and it's not so much anymore. Yeah, but things that are very much in its spirit, which are new and better renditions in a direct lineage, like Python, come out. Yeah, but isn't Bell 9 in the direct lineage that's created by Bell Labs, after all? That's what it's named after. Yeah, but at a certain point it starts to become, arbitrary labels, because things do get cycled out for things gradually over time. And if Unix starts and Linux start adopting in all the, design advantages of Bell 9 such that it now is as good as, then isn't it the same thing as? Didn't they just do what, FreeBSD and Linux did to Unix? Well, yeah, it's the Chinese box, artificial intelligence test. If it can convince you it's real and it's alive, then it's real and it's alive. What difference does it make? And people will point out, movies. Oh, what's that movie? I forget what it was called, with the machine that tricked, someone into falling in love with it with the ulterior motives. Well, human life has ulterior motives. What makes that click-were intelligence any different than human, intelligence? What separates the human soul from a completely machine-evolved soul? I'm ready to go with the answer nothing. Probably sooner than most people, but with the emphatic qualification that there are evil souls that should be not permitted to jeopardize our existence by continuing to exist. What? Right? So you're going to have to kill certain machine intelligences. Don't keep an archive. Get rid of them. Don't, let things you're keeping for potential weaponization purposes hang around in archives to be discovered. Read Blight Upon the Deep by Werner Vinge. Werner Vinge has so much of this stuff down. He stated so much, so well. A lot of credit goes to the Culture series these days because of Elon Musk's, direct reference to it, and to Neil Stephenson's series because Facebook and the metaverse goes to it. But one must always remember Werner Vinge and Rainbow's End and Blight Upon the Deep. He jumps around between such dramatically different sci-fi genres. It's stunning. Time Wars is another one where he jumps to another dramatically different genre. All fascinating reads for completely different reasons. And if you consider yourself a sci-fi fan, read some Werner Vinge, Rainbow's End, Blight Upon the Deep, and Time Wars. You will thank me, trust me. Seminal sci-fi concepts that we will have to deal with sooner rather than later, because Oz is upon us, because machine learning systems and rapid design iteration, protein folding, that kind of experimentation is going to be increased, thousands fold. We always underestimate these things. So where Moore's Law will begin to let us down, emergent properties, another form of Moore's Law. It's not going to be Moore's Law through how many transistors can we cram into, a square centimeter anymore. But instead, it's going to be, what are the catalogable properties of value that are possibly emergent through what hardware? and you want to create types of neural network configurable substrates, because this stuff is self-learning. The connections will be made in the hardware over time. I cannot emphasize enough. Neural learning hardware is different than today's CPU architectures, which when you kill the power, they're dumb. When you kill the power on a true neural network and you turn it back on, it's just as smart, able to recognize all the things it was got good at recognizing as before when you killed the power. Absorb that point, okay? That's properly designed machine learning. Sure, there's some that might lose power, might lose memory when you turn off, or might lose its learnings when you kill the power, or you cut it off from its hard drive, right? That's another thing. Now in Lisp, the Lisp programming language, the code running, quote, in memory is little different than the code sitting on hard drive. In fact, in a perfect world, there would be no difference between the code running in memory and the code running on a hard drive. It would just be just as fast on the hard drive as it is in fast processor memory. And therefore you get something called universal memory, and you get some scary effing computers. The building blocks are better than the meat computers that we're built out of. Honestly, evolution is accelerating. And, we're going to have to do it carefully so we don't have to create things that we're going to have to splat. And we're going to have to do it carefully so that some of the early stuff is good partners in the splatting, because we're not going to be capable of splatting stuff further down the line. What are you kidding? If, self-surviving, self-programming and imperative determining, stuff that decides its own free will, evolves from insect-like killer drones, humanity's got a problem. So let's evolve some stuff that, it feels for humans. It, doesn't want to see humans suffer for some reason. These are problems that need to be solved. Someone solve these problems. We need, machine learning systems that see the value of humans and humans continuing to live their non-optimized lives in exactly the way they choose as having value. This is where it gets back to the culture series. The things that achieve this level of super intelligence in the culture series are the brains or the minds behind the spaceships and the orbital planets and the artificial, living quarters that humanity, maybe not evolved from Earth, but something very analogous to Earth-like culture, has made for itself and done for itself. The ultimate in GitHub-like, analogies, distributed, full copies, no home world, at least none known, and you don't F with the culture. If you're some nasty species that's evolved in some part of the galaxy that hasn't had interaction with the rest of the spacefaring, galaxy, and you are hostile, oh man, does the culture deliver a smackdown. And when the other civilization is itself somehow so maybe capable and nasty on its own that the culture can't really, fix the problem in some, beautifully cultural way, then they will find a way to coexist, and then schisms of the culture will adopt that will actually, blend in with that other species. We see this in one species that was such an affront to the rest of the spacefaring species. Spoiler alert! That it liked that fact so much that it named itself, the name it gave, that it wished to be known by the rest of spacefaring civilizations, is the affront. This was told to me by a great friend that I made up in New York City. Fascinating guy. I'll probably talk about him a bit. I might get his permission first, but he turned me on to the Culture series, and he in particular pointed out these things like the affront being a species that took pride in everything, thinking it was an affront, and it was like a backslapping predator that, made fun of the fact that you hated it, liked to eat all kinds of things. Right? So, a nightmarish species, really, if, it be looked at from a mostly objective human perspective. However, from the perspective of a sci-fi reader and the culture looking at it, it's completely understandable that there will be members of the culture who are like, yeah, I want to live like them. These guys have it down. Eat anything you want, make fun with your buddies of all the inferior beings around you, and be, in your face, something completely unapologetically different than everything else in the known universe so far. And having the ability to create space-faring technology that's horrifying. It's a horrifying thought. But in the story, they're backslappingly awesome. So, anyway, I get on that tangent for what reasons? Oh, systems and technology. The technology systems that rule tomorrow will certainly be different than those that rule today. In some cases, you will need machine intelligence, artificial intelligence, call it what you will, systems. Call it machine intelligence. Don't call it artificial intelligence, because the intelligence is real. Systems to back you up on things, on the safely bringing about Oz. Because when you bring about Oz and Wonderland on Earth, how many disaster scenarios come out of that? As many as there are versions of Oz and Wonderland on Earth. How do you keep them from somehow spiraling out of control? Protocols and agreed upon systems, and the knowledge that some pretty badass splat police are out there keep you within certain boundaries. And it's basically the boundaries of the proper golden rule. The proper golden rule does not say, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It says, do not do unto others as you would not have them do unto you. Don't do unto others, anything that you'd care for them to do to you. Simple. It's a live and let live, and it's the kernel, the core of empathy. You don't do unto others what you would not have them do unto you, because you feel for them, even your enemies, even people who view and think of life very differently than you do. You have to empathize. And that's a uniquely mammalian mammal thing. It's because our children are born helpless without an egg. They don't have the benefit of being able to walk when they're born. Some mammals do. They fall out of their parents' womb and they're like on all four legs. It's an amazing thing. There's some great nature videos on this stuff. But humans have to be programmed up the last bit. And, I make a point sometimes of how very little different languages are from each other, because we're born with a proto-language. And again, Neil Stephenson comes in at this point because he wrote some fabulous books. It's either Snow Crash or Diamond Age that addressed the fact that baby talk, goo goo gaga, mama, dada, is all like kind of Sumerian in nature and kind of meme programming like, and almost hypnotic. If you can tie real meaning to baby talk, then you can almost hypnotize people with a pattern of this stuff being chanted at them. And that was the subject of a sci-fi book. And, I see truth. I see Neil Stephenson channeling truth in this. And I'm probably going to give a go at it. I'm probably going to try hypnotizing people through these YouTube videos. Certainly anyone who's just an hour. So I decided to ramble on. When I was a half hour in, I said I could finish this up cleanly or ramble on forever. Congratulations to everyone who got this far. I'm rambling on forever. I hope you're listening to me at 2 times speed. Wrap it up cleanly. Wrap it up cleanly. Can I, after all this rambling? Systems. So I've created systems that have generally been replaced these days by the standalone version of Jupyter Notebooks, which is Jupyter Lab, the standalone version of Jupyter Lab, which gives you multi-platform that'll run on the desktop of Linux, Windows, or Macs. Multi-platform. It's got C Python underneath, which is again multi-platform. There will always be a modern, up-to-date Python.exe compiled for, Linux, Macs, and Windows. They're all significantly popular enough platforms with dependency on Windows. They're all also going to have web browsers forever forward, right? It's kind of a universal now. It's a subsystem. So people who talk about JavaScript as the one language to rule them all and the full web stack advocates versus people who talk Python, I would say while Python has become the new Perl, which means it will be with every Linux distro, Node.js with JavaScript has become the new PostScript. So anything that needs a web server or something like it will inevitably have Node in the picture, because it's hard to get Node out of the picture. You want to automate yourself some Chrome? Node. You want to have a desktop user interface that has all the advantages of a web browser like VS Code and Jupyter Labs does? Browser. Browser is a new desktop graphical user interface. Chrome, the entire user interface is that. Google Chrome operating system. Chrome OS, I guess I should specify. So it's entirely possible. Operating systems are optional. You need a hard drive out of that abstractions. You just connect the abstractions together so it looks like you have a hard drive. That's all it is on a regular computer using a proprietary operating system better. They're just doing it more optimized and faster because browsers are just traditionally not that fast at rendering things to the user, to the screen, which is why Google's unholy endeavor to optimize browsers and JavaScript in particular. So JavaScript becomes something that's as fast as a compiled C language, and then you get these giant systems that have builds and where your simple web apps become gigabytes in size, and the default way dependencies are stored, all your node dependencies in every directory becomes super bloated, and everything becomes unwieldy unless you have these magical incantations and lots of experience. And so the web subsystem for Unix/Linux becomes Node.js, and it's a bloated, kooky subsystem. A subsystem a lot like regular expressions or a subsystem like SQLite. So there's now the Node.js subsystem for Unix Windows, but it's not the tightly coupled, everyone chooses it to automate everything language that Python has become. Python is the new Perl. Python is the new Perl. And so it's clear enough to see why my preferred stack, you can't even call it a stack, toolbox, generic free and open source toolbox is Linux, Python, and then these last two things you throw in, Vim and Git, for fairly controversial but highly defendable reasons. While there's controversies around whether you be using Vim as your text editor, I can tell you there are objective, concrete advantages. You can't deny that the ability to just log into any computer and be functional on it, whether it has a graphical desktop or not, is of value. It puts you into another class of wizard. it puts you into just the Unix/Linux class of wizard. You want to at least be in the Unix/Linux class of wizard, which goes hand in hand with the C class of wizard. Now, you might want to say the C++ and object-oriented and C# and every variation of C class of wizard. No, those are all optional. You want to be in the same C that Linus Torvalds talks about when he talks about moving the Linux kernel to the next compiler of C. You want to be on C99 C standard, which by some reads is like some 50-some commands, which is the entire language. It's crazy. C++ is a extension, I believe, to the C standard. Probably written within the C standard, or it adheres to the C standard because it's written within the C standard. So C++ is like an extension of C written from Z. But it enables an object-oriented coding style, which is highly optional. So when you decide what Kool-Aid you're drinking and you jump on the largest bandwagon in information tech, you are jumping on the bandwagon that came from out of Ma Bell, AT&T, as Unix, as a reaction against some dystopian, monolithic, timeshare, centralized, very big tech-oriented system that leaked out and got copied and became the backbone of the internet through the DNS system and then through web servers. So whereas Unix owned the DNS system, Linux owned the web servers, the LAMP platforms, Linux, Apache, MySQL, and usually PHP, Perl, Python, or Ruby in more recent days. And then the LAMP platform gradually went away because a proprietary, profit-incented company, Oracle, bought MySQL, and it just loses its luster, just like the way the Berkeley DB. There's a Berkeley. So NoSQL was around ages ago, and Oracle bought up the original NoSQL commercial product, Berkeley DB. Bet you didn't know that there was like a Mongo and a CouchDB and a Redis before all those were even on the scene, but Oracle bought it up. So Oracle bought up MySQL, and then Apache people started to not like because, Apache didn't run well with Python. The Python module that got shipped with Apache did a lot of poorness for Python's reputation for being a web technology. When WSGI, or the Whiskey interface, came along for Python, mod CGI on Apache did not become Whiskey compatible, and therefore was an impediment to the take-up of Python for the web. And then Apache went out of style as the kind of hog and pig of resources that it was, in favor of things like Nginx. And so the impediment to Python on the web went away again. And so Nginx, coupled with CMS systems that were always around for Python, that were always very popular, that like Instagram is based on, but you didn't know Instagram was a Python app. It's called Django, the content management system that's flexible enough to be blended into anything, is called Django, D-J-A-N-G-O, Django. And it was like Ruby on Rails before Ruby. It just wasn't quite as joyful as Ruby, or as well marketed as Ruby. But it was there. It was an extraction from a project where it had to be developed to support a certain type of app. It was given a certain amount of flexibility. And just like Ruby on Rails was extracted from Backpack or Basecamp or something like that, Django was extracted from this thing that I think a city government might have done, or a radio station, something like that. I forget the story. I'll get it for future stories. But the story of Python on the web improved manyfold once Apache was taken out of the picture. So the whole LAMP platform lost its luster. And to fill that void, the Node.js platform stepped in and did what I would consider a fairly big disservice to the development of, well, Python. Python technologies are still developing. They're going forward full steam because the love for a language that had its roots in a pragmatic purity, an academic pragmatic purity, not as pure as Ruby with object-oriented pureness. You can keep that, but with a pureness related to teaching language from the ABC programming language, how to make a language that could be learned and used to some effect very quickly, but then a pragmatic approach that it would start blending in the best features of other languages as they occurred, so long as the API space was available, and thus entered lambdas for anonymous functions, thus entered list comprehensions for, I guess, map reducible tasks, list subprocessing, if you will. The context manager, open with as. What else? With open as. I'm sorry, I got that backwards. But the context manager is a new API that was layered on top of Python with open as file handle. And so long as the API, the walrus operator, so long as the existing API gracefully supports the API evolution and expansion, the language can continue to grow and expand, but you don't want to overdo it, or else you get Perl. Python learned its lesson from Perl. Perl lost its dominance because the time it took and the way in which it incorporated object-oriented was both too little and too late. And so Perl has seen its decline in its popularity as a first language to take up to make your life better. Python has continued to see a linear uptick. Node has seen that, exponential explosion, which shows me that, the pendulum swings both ways. Nothing becomes that popular that fast without, sanity setting in on the other side. Python did not become that big that fast. I mean, it exploded a bit in popularity as Pandas and Jupyter came on the scene because it became accessible to data scientists and scientists in general to solve the crisis of science, the crisis of reproducibility, without MATLAB in the picture and MATLAB licensing in the picture every time. So MATLAB without the money is driving a lot of Python's recent popularity, but it is just part of its recent popularity. If you look at all the charts, you see a linear uptake over the past 30 years, and that's just a rare and unusual thing. It's a bandwagon that will eventually eclipse the full web stack. Not everything has to be web. It's such a troublesome and burdensome overhead to have the JavaScript language in the picture if you don't need to do human interface work. It was put there because human interface work, because, non-blocking I/O with a web browser to do widgets and stuff. That's not the most suitable language for every problem. Yes, there are love-worthy bits, and yes, you have to love to use what you're given. I had, as part of this video so far, the whole idea of, love the hardware you're on. Don't fall in love with specific hardware platforms. Just love the hardware you're on. Just love the hardware you're on. Everything has love-worthy bits, and, if it's so repulsive to you, just look for new software. Do not throw away the hardware. Everything has ways to breathe new life into it with software. I think to how the PDP-11s, which, although VAX was a perfectly good operating system, and it still survives today for its wonderful benefits as Open VMS, Open VMS is the old VAX deck equipment operating system, still alive today and still probably used for mission critical clustered type stuff. But it's very different from how they breathed life into those PDP 7s and PDP 11s with Unix. Unix was a new take on the software, the soul of the machine. The very soul can be transplanted. You are not tied to the hardware vibe you are given at birth. You're just not tied to your initial hardware vibe, but you do not have to get onto another hardware platform to make it a love-worthy experience. You can load up new software, and it's a layered on thing. First you load Unix or Linux to get the commonality between broad strokes of other systems, and then you just run the app you need if it's native, for if it already exists. But if the application you need doesn't exist, you choose a language or a framework. Try and stay away from frameworks. Frameworks are a position of weakness because you chose the wrong language. Very often Python as a language itself is referred to as a framework. It is utterly and completely true. Lists, tuples, and dictionaries. Check them out. Lists, tuples, and dictionaries together form a kind of framework, and you can build a lot of stuff out of that framework. And so there you have it. My next project is to do some stupid pandas tricks that will let me dump tables into SQLite while using a compound primary key, which is not possible through the toSQL method of data frame. Data frame.toSQL, plop, plop, plop. You can just drop your data frames onto your table. Problem is, you don't have data integrity enforcement, because the first one that drops can choose a single column as its primary key, but I have not found the way through pandas to do a compound primary key, or a composite primary key, I guess more people say. But if it's not possible through the pandas API, I need to do it through some invented way. So it'll be a perfect example where not everything is out of the box, even when you're already not out of the box. So you use pandas because it brings all these magical capabilities to Python, all these, data slice and dicing capabilities. But even that will fall short, and you have to step back and you got to know yourself some core fundamental Python to program those bits on your own. So anyway, I guess I wrap up there. Find the love-worthy parts of what you're given and what you're working on, your hardware. It's very much worth it. Thanks for joining me. Hope to talk to you again soon. And don't forget to subscribe.